Travelling on the first railways was an altogether different experience from what a modern audience would be used to. The seats lacked padding, and suspension in the carriages was advancing very slowly. There was also no lighting or heating. All in all, it would be a rather uncomfortable experience in the early years. The early carriages had no facilities in which to eat or to use the toilet. Instead, services would typically schedule in rest stops, in which the train would stop at a station in the middle of the route for 10 minutes or so, in order to allow the passengers to take care of these things. Often, these stops would happen at stations where there were no proper toilets. Instead, passengers would relieve themselves off the end of the platform, with ladies being directed down one end and the gents down the other. Even if the carriages did have facilities in which to eat or to use the toilet, passengers would have been unable to access them, as the early trains had no walkways. Once you had chosen a compartment, you were stuck in it for the rest of the journey until the train next arrived at a station, with whatever company you had. In early trains, the conductor would typically be seated on the roof and make their way along it during the journey, leaning down to check tickets through windows. As with everything else at the time, the railways were heavily segregated according to class. First and second class passengers had not only their own carriages, but usually their own separate trains, as well as separate waiting rooms and even separate ticket offices at entrances. Third class passengers, meanwhile, were rarely allowed in the stations at all. The only way they could travel was in open trucks pulled behind goods trains. Naturally, they would catch these trains in the goods yards, but this was actually pretty convenient for them, as the yards tended to be close to where most of them worked. Improvements in quality for the carriages would naturally start off in the first class and filter their way downwards. Luxuries like glass in the windows and padded seats were initially the exclusive domain of the first class. Third class transport rarely had roofs. Often, they even lacked walls or seats. Passengers just had to cling as best they could to a flatbed truck. The government were in no mood to change this arrangement. Many were opposed to the idea of poor people travelling on the railways at all, believing it would allow opportunities for vandals, allow criminals to escape justice, and for revolutionary ideas to spread. Following the success of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, routes began to be built across the country. Stephenson was consulted and asked what width of track some of these services should build them to. He said, "All the same, they may be far apart now, but they'll be linked up one day." 1834 saw the opening of the first railway in Ireland, between Dublin and Kingston. It followed the standard gauge, but was the only Irish line to do so. In the early years, every company there would operate to a different gauge. The Newcastle and Carlisle Railway opened in 1839, allowing the two port towns to communicate without a trek over the hills or a long voyage around Scotland. London gained its first railway in 1836, with the opening of London Bridge Station, the terminus of the London and Greenwich Railway. The final 3 kilometres of the line are along a straight stretch of raised arches. It was designed this way to allow the trains to be winched along. The London Council were concerned about the noise, smoke and sparks an engine would produce as the train passed by, and wouldn't allow them to run close to the city until 1844. It was a similar story when Euston opened in 1837. Claims that the early trains to Euston and London Bridge were winched due to the tracks being too steep are not true. However, it is true that many early trains would struggle on all but the slightest gradient. In the early days, it was common for them to be assisted by winches or by horses along the more difficult parts of the route. The speed with which the railways advanced from a collection of localised lines into a national network is simply incredible. Only 3 years after completing the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, George Stephenson was called to plan out the much longer Grand Junction Railway, linking Liverpool with Birmingham. Son Robert, meanwhile, was working on the London and Birmingham Railway. Construction of this line would require the workers to dig a mass of rock equivalent to 1.5 Great Pyramids over the course of 5 years. The Kilsby Tunnel near Rugby delayed the line's completion by 2 years. The 2.2-kilometre tunnel would be the longest in the world. Its route went through a much greater quantity of quicksand than their surveys had suggested. A series of pumps were set up to essentially drain the whole hillside dry, while workers on a floating platform battled to shore up the walls of the tunnel, stuffing straw around to try and stop the water washing the fresh cement away. Finally, in 1838, the tunnel was opened and the line was complete. The two companies were merged to form the London and North Western Railway. From the new terminus at Euston, it was now possible to travel to Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool in a matter of hours instead of days. Seeing that their line would one day be linked into this network, most engineers took Stephenson's advice and built their track to the uniform gauge of 4 foot 8 3/4, or 1.435 metres. But one man chose to disregard this advice completely, and that was the legendary Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Brunel noted that Stephenson had built his line to the gauge he had simply because it was the width of the track for the coal mines he'd been working on early in his career, and this had been set as a convenient width for workhorses and trucks. Brunel saw this as arbitrary and believed he could build tracks that were better tailored for steam power. To this end, he built his tracks to a width of 7 feet and a quarter inch, or 2.134 metres. He dubbed this broad gauge. His reasoning was that wider trains would have a lower centre of gravity. They could be fitted with bigger, more powerful engines, capable of carrying more fuel and able to take bends at greater speeds. Perhaps most importantly, they could pull wider carriages, giving more space for passengers and freight, and also allowing for a smoother ride. Brunel was a brilliant mind, but he was often more concerned with seeing what was technically possible than what was commercially viable, and also struggled to listen to reason. Had he had the broad gauge idea just a few years earlier, it may have kicked off a trend. As it was, so much standard gauge track had been built by this time that it seemed unnecessary to rethink it. What's more, the trains Brunel designed to run on his lines, while they were superior in performance to most standard gauge trains, the difference was not enough to inspire other companies to change their designs, and so they continued with the standard gauge. In time, operating a different gauge to everybody else would put a severe strain on Great Western's business. Some of Brunel's other ideas would pay off a lot better. For instance, he designed the route with a large sweep to the north for no clear reason. He put it this way as it would allow the company to connect to cities in the north later. Where the route crossed the Thames at Maidenhead, Brunel designed 2 of the flattest brick arches in the world. So much so that Great Western were convinced they were going to collapse. Despite Brunel's meticulous calculations, they refused to remove the scaffolding from the arches upon completion, until a storm blew through in 1839 and blew away the scaffolding, but left the arches intact, vindicating Brunel. Brunel was nothing if not ambitious. His plan for the railway was not only to connect London to Bristol, but also to load the trains onto his new transatlantic steamers, then unload them in America and continue to locations there. This continuous service had to be abandoned when Bristol Council wouldn't give him permission to build through the city. The railway was completed in 1841, with the opening of the Box Tunnel near Bath. At almost 3 kilometres, it was now the longest tunnel in the world. Urban legend has it that the sun will shine straight through it at dawn on Brunel's birthday. This was confirmed by GWR in 2017, although 180 years of dust and grime stops the light travelling all the way through. The network was growing fast, but the railways were not always welcome. Whilst most agreed that the railways were a good thing, not everyone wanted one in their back garden. Rural regions didn't want to be disturbed by the noise and the smoke that the trains naturally brought with them. Farmers also feared the smoke would poison the crops and the sight would spook the animals. Meanwhile, urban areas were reluctant to demolish wealthy sections of town to make way for the railways. Railway companies would have to either build their stations outside the city limits or bulldoze through poor neighbourhoods instead, tossing a lot of people out of their home without a penny. Others were afraid that the railway would bring with it undesirable types. In Slough, though a line was built past the town, nearby Eton School was able to successfully campaign to stop a station being built there for a long time. The professors feared that the schoolboys would use it to go on to trips into London and visit the brothels there. Great Western got around this problem by simply having the trains stop near a pub, where they'd done a deal with the owner who would sell tickets and people would just climb in. The Eton boys could go and indulge their debauchery after all. Other objectors were the owners of the canals, toll roads and coaching inns, who feared loss of business, and they were probably right to do so, but they had a hard job holding back progress. Another concern was with strangers travelling together. With passengers in a particular compartment stuck there until the train reached the next station, it could provide great opportunities for thieves, murderers and rapists. The rail companies alleviated the latter issue somewhat by introducing women-only carriages, an idea which is surprisingly controversial nowadays. And of course there were the natural technophobic reactions. Stories spread of conditions of railway madness, in which the sounds and the shaking of the trains would slowly drive people insane. Others believed that the human body would be unable to handle the high speed for too long, or that the noise of the engine would lead to every lady the train passed fainting. A more legitimate concern was with accidents. Almost every week, the papers would be full of a news story of some trouble caused by the railways, people falling on the tracks, derailments, and even collisions. Relatively, train travel was still no more dangerous than any other mode of transport, but the trains were the first in which the passenger had no easy communication with the driver, and the lack of control naturally unnerved people. But engineers and train crews were learning from these accidents. This had begun almost as soon as the railways had got going. Some early engines had no brakes, and could only be stopped by throwing them into reverse, a process which took time, as Huskisson had found out the hard way. Following his death, Stephenson gave an order that all engines running on his lines must now be fitted with proper handbrakes. One problem which unnerved the Victorian public was the possibility of the boiler exploding. It was rare, barely once a decade on the rails, but scary when it did happen. Guidebooks often advised people to seat compartments as far back from the engine as possible, just in case. The engineers were well ahead of them. From the earliest days of steam engines, safety valves had been fitted, which would come open and safely evacuate the steam if the boiler reached a dangerous pressure. The early ones were held shut with a weight, which was all fine for a stationary engine, but on a moving vehicle it would shake and frequently pop open, wasting steam. Stephenson resolved this by replacing the weight with a spring. Unfortunately, many operators would screw down the safety valve to coax a bit more speed out of the engine, increasing the danger of the boiler exploding. Engineers repeatedly modified their valves to make them harder to screw down. In 1833, a train on the Leicester and Swannington Railway struck a cart on a level crossing. No one was hurt, but it led to drivers calling for a better means of warning people they were coming. Stephenson introduced steam whistles to all his trains. The first points were introduced in 1832. Mechanical signals were also introduced. Early on, each set was operated by individual levers. Later, complicated arrangements of rods and chains would be introduced, which allowed all points and signals to be operated from a raised platform. This would soon evolve into the signal box. Interlocking systems were built in order to prevent dangerous combinations of points and signals being created. In the early days, there was no means of communicating between these boxes. Instead, they would have a meticulous schedule worked out in advance, and would only allow trains down particular lines at precise intervals. If something went badly wrong along the line, it was up to the driver to keep an eye out for trouble ahead. Though the signal operators were referred to as signal men, it was actually one of the first railway jobs open to women, and there were a good number of them. The operators tended to live at the box, and hours were long, so it would usually become a family business. The coming of the railways had an impact on society comparable to the coming of digital communications in the modern age. Suddenly, it was possible to travel over great distances without dedicating whole days to it. At the same time, goods could be rapidly moved all over the country in bulk for the first time. Where possible, factories were connected directly to the railway lines, allowing them to bring in a rapid supply of raw materials and to load the finished goods straight onto freight trucks. Often they would reach the markets the day they'd left the factory, increasing turnover and accelerating the Industrial Revolution. National newspapers saw a massive growth too. Whilst they had existed before the railways, they would be several days out of date by the time they could reach the far ends of the country. Now they could be distributed everywhere the day they were printed. Food too was revolutionised. Up until now, it had only been possible to eat what was produced locally and in season. It was possible to transport by coach, but expensive. Now rapid transport, along with better preservation methods, allow consumers a much richer choice of diet. Even such iconic meals as fish and chips were largely exclusive to the coasts, until the railways allowed rapid transport inland. The railways also made it much easier to supply the inner cities with food and essentials, making urban living a lot more comfortable. And the railways seemed to stimulate growth wherever they went. Raw materials became cheaper for industries. It was possible to connect with new markets and new investors. The railways also brought in no shortage of customers for local businesses. The railways themselves provided no shortage of employment too, and employment opportunities were boosted further as it was now practical to commute to work for the first time, allowing families to seek work in another town without having to completely uproot themselves. When the Stockton and Darlington Railway was extended to Middlesbrough in 1830, the hamlet had a population of just 40. By 1851, it was a thriving port town with a population of 7,600. Not only did the railways boost the growth of towns, they also built some almost from scratch. Places like Swindon and Crewe were sleepy villages when the railways came through, but seemed like the perfect place to house the workers. The railway companies made sure to provide well for them, building not just housing, but also schools, hospitals, places of worship, and communal areas for the workers and their families. This kept the workers happy and meant that there was no alternate employer around if the workers did wish to quit. The railways also created whole new types of businesses. One such example revolves around a Quaker minister from Leicester called Thomas Cook. In 1841, he was planning on visiting a temperance rally near Loughborough. He wanted to bring as many of his congregation and fellow teetotalers with him as possible, but he knew that some would struggle with the rail fares. He was able to do a deal with the company for him to bulk book seats at a reduced rate. He then sold around 300 of them, organising a big party to bring along, and made a tidy profit for himself. This got him wondering if he could make a business doing this, and he rapidly began planning similar excursions to other parts of the country. In time, he would expand into arranging meals, entertainment, activities, and accommodation, and selling this all to the guests in one payment. He thus invented the package holiday, and the Thomas Cook Company would remain a staple of the travel industry until 2019. By 1841, what had once been a scattered collection of lines had now formed into what could properly be described as a network. It was clear that the railways were there to stay, but it was also clear that the companies could no longer operate in their own bubbles. Agreements would have to be reached between the owners to create a standardised service across the country. Join us next time as we look into how this coordination was achieved, how this affected the way we tell time, and also how the rail companies saw their greatest market boom followed by their greatest market crash. Thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I'm currently working on part 3, which will cover the 1840s. And if you would like to see more examples of my artwork, there is a link to my website and my Etsy page in the description. I have very elaborate views of many of the world's cities, and it's well worth checking out. See you next time.